Welcome to The Way We Roll with me, Simon Minty.
And me, Phil Friend.
Now, anyone who takes an interest in equality and diversity knows that the language and the words that we use don't remain the same.
And perhaps we should give you a warning that we will use a few old words seen as possibly offensive to some in this show. For example, once upon a time, I'm now known as a wheelchair user, but I was called a cripple.
And I was handicapped for the first 10 years of my life. And then that changed to disabled or disabled person. And that's pretty much stuck up until more recently.
So let's take a slightly wider view. What we and many of you will have used and may have experienced is something called disability discrimination. Indeed, there was an act in 95 in the UK called the Disability Discrimination Act, which aimed to ensure equal and fair treatment of disabled people.
But the times are a-changing, though. A word that is almost common parlance amongst politically active and younger disabled people and in academia is ableism. We've mentioned it a few times in previous shows, but we really wanted to dig deeper and get to understand it more and really explore it.
Which is where our guest for today comes in. We are totally delighted to have Professor Fiona Kumari Campbell, who is Professor of Disability and Ableism Studies in the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Dundee, and she's with us. Hello, Fiona.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you guys.
Fabulous.
Are we okay calling you Fiona? I thought we should call you Professor or something.
No, Fiona's fine. Just I'm surprised you put the A in. I must remove that A, otherwise it gets too long.
Phil did a beautiful job of that. I was really impressed, and because I write the script, I get him to do the hard bits and give me the easy bits. So it was well done, Phil. Now I'm going to go straight in. You have the word ableism in your job title.
Yes.
You've written extensively about this as a topic. We will go in depth, but just could you summarize what it means in a sentence?
Well, ableism is a family of ideas. It's kind of like an ethos about abledness. What do we mean by the abled body? What do we mean by the perfected body or the ideal body? The productive body. So that's really what it's about.
So Fiona, I mean, in your biography or your biog, it says that you're a non-traditional academic, being biracial, disabled, LGBTQ+, and from a religious minority background. So for us and our listeners, can you unpack that a little for us? Well, I mean, whatever you want to share with us that you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the journey, you've been on a journey, you're now where you are. What I'd be, and I'm sure the listeners would like, is just some background to how you got to this point.
Yeah, look, thanks. I think that's really important because we are embodied people and we're influenced and affected by our life experiences. Things don't just drop down from heaven, although that would be quite nice sometimes when you're looking on a book deadline. So the other reason why I put that information in my biography was to I guess challenge the view that, academics are in ivory towers or from privileged backgrounds. So I have a Sri Lankan mother and a Scottish father who married in Australia. So that's why I've got the Australian accent. And they married actually under the White Australia policy. Some of you might not be familiar with that, but up until 1972, people of non-European backgrounds were not allowed to enter Australia or become citizens. So I think my mother was quite a pioneer in that respect. So I guess sometimes I'm described as a person in between two cultures, and I think that's been a theme throughout my life of kind of being raised in the West on Western values, but at the same time very much shaped and coloured by a South Asian experience, particularly related to Buddhism. And an outlook really. So I think that's really important. In terms of disabilities, again, I don't know whether it's such an issue in the UK, but in Australia, most people who study disability or get jobs in universities or indeed senior positions in disability agencies are people who tend not to identify as disabled. So and so that's very important. There's very few disabled people who actually get through undergraduate. courses in universities, let alone go on to other things. So, so in 1981, and I think, you know, we have this kind of spiritual thing about kind of auspicious moments. So in 1981, in the International Year of Disabled People, I became a C6 on 7 incomplete quadriplegic. Yay! So it was, and so that was the year. But what I didn't know back then, it only came out later with diagnostic testing, is that I'm also autistic and have dyscalculia as well. So I have, you know, I have a number of disabilities that are there. So yeah, so in terms of a non-traditional path, and this is where I think it's important, my first job was in a sheltered workshop, putting lids on bottles, knives and forks and airline bags back in the days when you could have real knives and forks. There was a culture of low expectation. So for me, I was told quite explicitly, you can't go to university. I just started university before I became unwell. You can't go to university. The sheltered workshops are best. They had booked a bed in a nursing home. I think you call them care homes here, quadriplegic centre. And that was it. So it was that tyranny of low expectation. I lasted about 2 weeks in the sheltered workshop, gave them the finger. I told you I'm not allowed to swear here. So I gave them the finger and ended up actually, my first volunteer job was at a organisation called the Disability Resources Centre, which was run by and for disabled people. And I think that's really interesting, particularly for the young ones who might be listening. I mean, we've kind of almost regressed in some ways. The idea of organisations that provide services, that do research where all the staff, all the members are disabled is powerful, but it's still quite unique. So I was exposed to a lot of disabled people older than myself that were doing different things, and they kind of trained me up. And yeah, so
Fiona, it is a remarkable intro. I have a quick one-liner and then a bigger question. You've reminded of a story that we used to say, that there was people working in the sheltered workshops. They would have to put these knives and forks in little things and seal them, but because it was the most miserable job ever,
monotonous,
they would just have a little spit, and they would spit in them before they sealed them, just to get their own back. Now, it wasn't you before you gave them the finger, was it?
No, in fact, to be honest, I was, and I think again, this, in all seriousness, I was quite submissive, and anytime I was near institutional authority or went near hospitals, I was very quiet and timid. I mean, you kind of that kind of idea of low expectations, it kind of like sinks into your mind. I think the big change, if I may say, before you go into ableism, the big change for me, and it was a historical moment, again, one of those auspicious occasions, I got a project and I was paid $35,000, and this is 81, right? 81, 82, a hell of a lot of money, like, you know, and it was by an insurance company, and it was to distribute a book called Into the Streets to people living in asylums and nursing homes. And that's what I did. I took this book, because it was pre-internet, obviously, to people who had been incarcerated, about their options of leaving and meeting with these people. And that was the real turning point, to go into these settings. And you know, again, that historical memory, I think many people have no understanding about what it was really like to be in institutional environments and what that did for you.
Fiona, given the complexity of who you are, disability seems to be the primary driver. So race and gender and sexual orientation, sexuality, those sorts of things, clearly important to you, but they're not the thing that we've got to know you about.
Can I say, to be honest, you know, I've had a love-hate relationship with disability generally. The disability rights movement, you know, is like any social movement, is factionalized with bloody, you know, egotists and power mongers and, you know, politics and things. So I would dip in and out of that. And the same with disability studies. I've always had as my second preoccupation to keep life interesting is to look at non-Western knowledges. Okay, so looking at other ways of viewing things. And what's increasingly happened in the last few years is those two areas have come together. help shape my ideas, and also to make sure that when we're thinking about disability, it is truly a global perspective, not just a Western perspective.
Yes, important. Yeah.
So the ableism, I remember someone phoning me about 8-10 years ago saying, have you heard this? What do you think? And I said, it will catch on, but it's going to be a while yet. Then in the last year or two, I've seen it a lot on social media, particularly international younger people using it, saying this is ableism, this is ableism.
Oh, yeah.
A very good friend who's become disabled, is doing a lot of academic study, quoted it to me. And I said, what does it mean to you? And there was this big pause. And I thought, okay, so a lot of people are using this, but they don't actually know what it means. Now, I had to do a talk this week and they said, oh, you must do ableism and microaggressions. I'm like, oh, goodness, okay. So if I distill it, it's disability discrimination. But you've already alluded to, no, it's about the body, it's about productivity. Tell me, you were around at the source of it, and how do you understand it?
Okay, the first thing that I should say is, you know, and I've been writing about this. In fact, I've been banging on about this in the last 12 months about the misuse of the concept of ableism, or the term, because it gets used now as like a kind of sledgehammer, right? And like racism, yeah. So it gets kind of like, well, you're ableist, you know, ooh, you know, and but people don't actually say what it means. The other thing, and I'll unpack this a bit. The other thing is there is an interpretation of ableism which I disagree with, and that's actually totally off the mark, and that's the one, unfortunately, that I think is pretty dominant these days. I think particularly with you mentioned about young people and social media, I think the influence of the way Americans young Americans and undertake their activism is kind of running the show here. So let's take it apart then. So one of the things that I started with in the early days, and it was accidental, by the way, my definition of ableism, which I came up with in 2001, which was about that idea of the kind of perfect idealized body, you know. So I'm giving you a summary here, and that anything that can't measure up to that or is diminished becomes disabled. That's kind of like the kind of paraphrased version, right? And I only restricted it to disability. But that was just a mere footnote, you know, in an article about the way in which disabled people are represented and in the court system, right? So that's my background that was writing about disability in courts, that, you know, you're either a hero or a sufferer, or, you know, that sort of thing. So it kind of, it was never my intention to kind of go down the line of ableism. But one of the things that I guess got me onto that was I thought, well, hang on a minute, you know, when we talk about research and when we talk about policy, most of the spotlight is on disability, right? And I kept thinking about, well, you know, in all social systems throughout history, there's always been this notion of what it means to be the ideal citizen. You think about the Roman Empire, you know, the idealized body, you know, the kind of social roles and the kinds of things that are valued, right? And again, and parallel to that then are all the kind of misfits, or what I now call disposable peoples, who don't measure up to that, right? So the other thing that influenced me, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to compact this so it's not too long, and you've got other questions. The other thing, Bell Hooks, who's an African-American academic, she wrote a paper, I don't know, about 20 years ago now, and she said, and again, I'm paraphrasing it, and the fact that I remember it is really interesting. She said, in theory, I found a place of healing. Theory helped me make sense of my lived experience, right? So social theory is really an explanatory narrative. It's a conversation about why is it so? Why do these things happen, right? And people come up with all sorts of, you know, explanations. The social model of disability, as I was saying the other day, and, you know, people can misinterpret this, the social model of disability is not a fact, right? The social model of disability is a theory, right? A theory about how disability is produced, why is there inequality, and how does it relate to the economy, right? And we know, and I mean, you guys are UK folks, so we know it comes out from an era that had a heavily Marxist influence, right? And this kind of means of relation to the means of production, right? And where there's an oppressor and the oppressed. Now, why I'm mentioning this is we'll come back to this, because two of my gripes about ableism, on one hand, it was a slow burner. You're right to project that. It was a slow burner, not much. You know, when my book Contours of Ableism came out in 2009, it was the first book. There hasn't been that many other books, and you know, and in the UK there were some people who were quite grumpy about that, because they said, well, we're using the word disableism, you know, what's this other new kid on the block kind of thing. And you know, I kind of responded to that, and maybe that can be a separate question later. But so just hold your horses.
Maybe
hold your horses. Yeah. So there wasn't, and then I started. And there wasn't really that much interest. You know, who's this kind of, you know, Australian, you know, I can't think what the word is, you know, kind of interloper or whatever, coming in telling us what to do. And I'd say there is some freedom when you're not in the US and you're not in the UK, because there's lots of factional brawls about knowledge. And you know, when you're in the arse end of the world and the antipodes, you can kind of do what you want, you know, so without all that fracas. So it's slowly picking up, which I was really excited. But the problem is, and this is the bit that I was banging on about, so I'm going to talk to you about two things, right? One is consistently the word ableism is used without people explaining what they mean, right? So you've already touched on that, right? Yeah. So this is consistent. Now, it's on social media, but more scaringly, or scary, anyway, more concerningly, is that even in academic research articles, you know, someone will just bung in of something on ableism, use the word ableist or ableism, and they don't explain what it is. Because my little crap detectors, my little antennae that comes up, I was really wanting to have a conversation with people about this. You know, there's something a bit scary about talking to yourself all the time. And so anytime I saw, you know, the Google search came up and ableism was there, I'd kind of say, okay, what are they going to say about it? What are they going to say about it? And nothing. It was assumed that we all knew what it meant. And then people would then basically talk about what its impact was, what ableism does, right? But they didn't say what it was, which is kind of like really, really flawed. I mean, you know, it'd be like talking about a car and saying what a car does without even describing what the car is in the first place, and how do we differentiate between cars and trucks? Do you know what I mean? I know that's a bit of a strange analogy, but we need to kind of do that. But the other, so that's the first area, and that's a continual issue, right? And I've got a recent published paper in 2019, I think, called Precision Ableism. Like, this is the stuff that you would teach your students. If you're going to use a term, define it. You know, and then you're in charge, you're in control of the narrative, and off you go. But there's been a lot of resistance with this. The other area that I'm really concerned about, and I think it's an overhang from not just the social model, but this kind of Marxist leftist approach to things, is the desire to always find an enemy. That we can push the guns at, right? So what we have is this discrimination narrative. A number of people describe ableism as a system in favor of able-bodied people, right? That's the one you hear variations of. It's the ables, they're the problem, and they're out to get us, right? And the system privileges them, right? I guess, look, I'm going to tame myself. I could say it's a load of crap. Yeah, well, I've actually just said that. There you go. You know, this is ridiculous. Ableism affects everybody, right? In different ways and to different degrees. You know, when a young teenage person who doesn't identify as disabled, a woman looks in front of the mirror, you know, in the morning and thinks, oh God, I'm ugly, or what do I have to do to kind of fix myself up? And, you know, how do I look healthy? When, you know, a middle-aged worker in the workplace thinks, oh, look, I'm not keeping up to pace with what's expected of me to do, you know, all these things are ableist ideas. Even the idea of what do they call it? The fountain of youth.
I'm going to jump in just for a minute. So that's sort of that aspirational bit you started at the beginning, the sort of the goddess body or the atlas or whatever it is that we all can't match up to, but all to different levels.
We can't match up, and we all want to belong. Like human beings, the human condition is, you know, even people like myself that are quite reclusive, we are social creatures. We want to belong, right? So James Overbow, many years ago, he's a Canadian disabled scholar, and he used the phrase normative shadows, right? Normative. And you can imagine like the idea of this shadow, and it kind of moves over the top of us. And even if we want to reject what we consider to be popular or normal or, you know, posh or whatever, the very fact that we're having to kind of push back on this is we are engaged in this issue, right? And Robert McRuer used the idea of compulsory able-bodiedness, right? So I think what for me, when I started looking at, I said we need to study what ableness means. What does ability mean? What, you know, and to put the spotlight, instead of looking at the spotlight on disabled people, I'm not saying disabled people are not relevant, and I'll come back to that later, and maybe you can ask me a question about that. But the focus then, you know, but the focus is on this kind of very elusive, hard area about what does abledness mean. Yeah. And it changes throughout history. It changes in society, right? And the reason why I'm saying this, I'm going to shut up in a minute so you can ask another follow-up. But so one of the things I've said over the years is that saying that ableism is not just about disability. It emerged from disability studies, from disability activism, right? But actually ableness in terms of the people who are disposable are refugees, are stateless persons, people who are at the lower end of the caste system, and even race, right? So in fact, this is a system of hierarchy, a system of differentiation that affects more than disabled people.
Thank you, Fiona. For me, it was fabulous. I've been waiting to hear something like that for so long. It's untrue. But Phil,
I wanted. I mean, likewise, Simon. I think that was. I kind of get it. I understand it, and I've been in this game for a long time. And as Simon, you know, alluded to, the word has begun to get used in very common currency and never defined. I wanted to ask Fiona just around the issue of what makes disabled people different in many ways, of course, is that they can become it. So you're born into a situation, you've described your own life like that. You were minding your own business and then you became a quadriplegic. So I'm wondering how ableness works inside somebody who started life as a non-disabled person and then becomes a disabled person, and how they manage that. Because I think sometimes the term ableism is defined as an internal, and you've just talked about that too.
We're totally saturated with it.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, you know, thinking of our listeners, if you've led your life and then become a disabled person, and now you're trying to reposition yourself in some way, what you're thinking, what your studies have shown you in that kind of area.
Yeah, well, you know, ableism is like the monkey on the back, right? So all of us, every single human being within 5 minutes of birth are enrolled in a system of ableism. Now, what do I mean by that? That's a huge claim. There's a thing called the APGAR score. So within 5 minutes of a baby being born, right, they are ranked. They're ranked according to particular specifications about what it means to be healthy, right? And from that 5 minutes onwards, all of us are enrolled in this system of ableism. And what happens is we internalize it. So in 2005, I did publish an article called Internalized Ableism. And to be honest, I was influenced by the writings of critical race theory and black writers talking about how you know, people of color internalize racism. You know, it's and so the first thing to say about that is and that's that's a really core area for disabled people, because for people who acquire disabilities, they've just assumed able-bodiedness. It's like the story, I don't know what your disabilities are, but it's like the story of when you first go out, and if you're using a walking stick or a wheelchair, you suddenly see all these people around and you've never seen them before. Or like in my case, I have had I still have a child, she's now 20, but I can remember wheeling the pram, you know, and suddenly thinking, oh my God, there's all these women with prams around, you know. So you just don't see it because it's not part of your consciousness, right? So I think the what happens often when people acquire disabilities, not in all cases, they have to deal with their own adjustment. I mean, this is a life-changing event for people who acquire disabilities, right? And for some people it's instant, for some people it's over, you know, a few months if they have you know, an illness or whatever. So they have to what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? They have to kind of all these values and important qualities in one's sense of self that makes one worthy overturned. So it's so first what happens is disintegration, and then there's integration of a reintegration of that. And also this is not just you know, a monk in a cave experience. The problem about this is it happens within the social system itself outside, like rehabilitation. So for example, in rehabilitation services, I don't know if it happens as much now, but there's been research done, for example, with people who've had amputations, they've been told to cover, they must cover their amputated limb or whatever, or conceal, you know, and you know, the inference obviously from that is that, you know, well, it's to avoid stigma, but then it's, well, there's something, you think, well, maybe there's something wrong about that. Do you know what I mean? So, and right. I know in my day, it was about people in wheelchairs wearing tracksuit pants. You was absolutely discouraged because there was this whole thing about predominantly guys in chairs wearing tracksuit pants, you know.
There's so much you said. A couple of bits I wanted to pick up. Phil, post polio, 3 years old, getting it. I have dwarfism and was born with it, and I'm feeling guilty of that. You've mentioned some of that sort of pecking order, weird stuff about getting it and having it and how long you've had it, all those things that we know exist. You mentioned internalized ableism, and that is springing up alongside ableism. And also what I always used to talk about was something like internalized oppression. We used to use that as a phrase.
Yeah, so, that was the generic model.
Right.
Yeah.
And but that one is a bit more accurate, the way people are using internalized ableism. It is a sort of comparison thing.
Well, it is. And can I say, I always say that disability is a state of ambivalence. What do I mean by that? For most of us throughout our lives, and you know, we change as we grow older and whatever else is happening to us, is often we hold joy and despair in tension, right? Because, you know, particularly for people who, like, I think I've got my shit together about disability these days, you know, but I suffer from really, really acute pain, you know, and I'm now starting to have the effects of aging. And, you know, being autistic causes all sorts of dramas. It didn't cause dramas until I moved to the UK, and that's another whole story. You can interview me about that at some stage, the whole cultural overlay. I mean, I just kind of, you know, I was an autistic person most of my life. I just masked it and got on with the business, and then came here and everything kind of collapsed. But I think what I'm saying is, you know, this idea that you'll just get over it. And I think we need to talk about depression. Ableism kills. Ableism is harmful. Right, always it wears you down. I mean, you know, even now, and I'm in a privileged position. I'm a professor, right? I'm earning good money, but you know, I experience day-to-day forms of humiliation. You know, this stuff gets to you. And just speaking about to Phil there, because I think we're both old cronies here, although he just told me he's a little bit older. You know, this stuff wears you down, and we have this accumulated humiliation, and it's generational too, because, you know, to suddenly think that, you know, those of us who were raised in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the kind of treatment we had, that somehow we'll just get over it and move on. These things leave deep, tormenting scars, you know, and we haven't dealt with it enough, because there's a fear of pathologizing disabled people. I mean, my view is if you didn't start off with depression, having a disability, you would have secondary depression, because we're living in a very hostile world.
Is there in your experience something that you'd offer to say to somebody? Because I get totally what you're saying. You know, I'm now in my 7th decade. I'm a grandparent, and grandparents experience different things from being a parent, which I also was. So I get that journey thing you're talking about. I thought, oh, I've got this sorted now. And then along came a child and oh, bugger it. I haven't really understood what.
Yeah, it comes back to hit you between the eyes, doesn't it, Phil?
It does, yeah. Do you have a sort of, I don't want you to give advice, but many of the people listening to us, I hope, are getting incredible help from what you're saying. And I'm wondering whether there are things they could do internally that would give them a better chance of making sense of all this.
Yeah, well, so I'm not some sort of oracle giving advice, no, but there are a couple of things, and I did it last year for the Disability History Months. I did a presentation on disability consciousness raising groups, and I'm going to write that up because I think there's a real need for disabled people to meet each other. I mean, one of the downsides of mainstreaming, for want of a better word, is that disabled people are separated from each other, right? It's not like in, the Caribbean community in the UK that you can kind of all settle in one spot and have a lovely cultural background where you can kind of celebrate the good things and the bad. Disabled people have been intentionally dispersed, right? This is and I've written about that. It's quite intentional, right? So actually role modeling and mentoring is important. A consciousness raising group, I found one example. So this is only in the last 12 months. So that's something that I would like to get off the ground as a project where disabled people get together. It's not a support group or a whinge group or a bitch group or whatever. It's the idea with a consciousness raising group, each time people meet, they pick a theme, right? They pick a theme and they talk about it. They look at the commonality and shared experiences. They look at the differences, and then they develop strategy out of that, right? So that's the thing. It's about action. Yeah. So I think that is really critical. The other thing, can I say, and I've been quite shocked about this because my Contours of Ableism book is social theory. It was written for that market. It's got nasty big words in it. It's not accessible in that sense. I mean, I've got other things, but I've had so many letters and emails from young folk around the world who have bothered to sit down and probably get a migraine in the process of reading it. Why? Because for some reason it's actually helping them make sense of their lived experience. Here's that kind of bell hooks idea again, and it's been a watershed moment for them. They've almost been relieved of this burden, because we blame ourselves as human beings. We say, why can't I be stronger, right? Why can't I do things better? And like this Olympic stuff's coming up again, and this idea of the overcomer. So I think one of the things I've emphasized, and this is not just for ableism, by the way, we are living in a world where all sorts of things pass as truth and fact, and don't even get me on to this discussion, but we need to read more, we need to think, we need to talk, we need to analyze what people are saying, because some of the stuff that's being said, frankly, is just rubbish, right? And the problem that I have about the overuse of the word ableism at the moment, and it scares me, is firstly that the Americans are running the show, and I'm probably going to get absolute shit box back on this whole thing, right? But I mean, America is an empire, and like Americans control printing and media and whatever, but it empties it by using it without explaining its meaning. What it does is it makes it vacuous. It empties it of its meaning, right? And that's really dangerous. The other thing is it is a hostile conflict way of using it, this idea of the ables being the enemy. I mean, what are we trying to do? Set up some kind of divisive politics here?
And this is, you're raising so many brilliant points. The fear that I have is we're closing the conversation, we're not opening it up. And I want allies. I want people to get it. I want people to understand and improve it, not to terrify the life out of them. But I do wonder sometimes, I see a next generation, they go, well, good on you, because you're less soft than me. Maybe I'd have let a little bit more go. And they're brutal. They're saying, no, 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 no. There's a line you mentioned about the, internal mainstream. Oh, so it was intended mainstreaming of people.
Yeah, dispersal.
That's a better word. Phil and I run career development programs for staff who have disabilities who work for organizations.
Yeah.
And we see them come in 2 or 3 days later, they leave and they're different. And the reason being, it's the first time they got to hang out with 12 other people who've got conditions.
Absolutely.
And they all talk about it without fear or judge, or it's all supportive, and boom. And Phil believes it's because, no, we don't go to special school, so we don't get that. Now, some of
He's right. He's right.
Yeah, but then I would flip and say I go to Little People of America conventions and I adore them. It's a shot in the arm. It's empowering.
Yeah,
it's
I've
joy.
seen videos of it. Yeah,
exactly. We drink and we have sex and lots of other things as well. However,
too much information.
We actually, it's what everyone says, but we actually do have really good debates and discussions. The flip side of that is I don't want to live there. I do want to live in. I'm going to get in trouble. The real world. That feels slightly strange. So I don't want to get stuck there. Maybe I want to be able to flip between the two. My last bit, you said about the American dominance. I think if we are talking about disability rights and the studies and the academic, surely we're sophisticated enough to be able to be critical of each other. There was a point where you couldn't. You said the social model wasn't fact. Absolutely. But you weren't allowed to question it. But I think to take this forward, we've got to be more sophisticated. And more open.
We do, and we have to be more open. And unfortunately, the problem what happens with the history of knowledge, and this is not a disability issue at all, is that sometimes you'll get orthodox ideas, and then some whippersnapper will come along, and say challenge it, and that'll become like radical, critical, and then over time that radical criticalness then becomes the new orthodoxy, right? And we see this, right? And particularly with factions, they are about controlling borders. So even with this kind of critical disability studies, there are certain things you can say and certain things that you can't say. But I want to get back to the issue of that you raised, which is really important, about coalition building, right? And again, in my last paper that I did at a conference for on intellectual disability, IACID, I talked about the fact that actually, again, for the last 10 years, I've been saying, please do research beyond disability. I'm not saying don't do disability research, but look at how ableism affects other groups. It's been really quiet. There's been real resistance. The people who've picked it up have been folk in India and places like that, but not in the West. And one of the things that, that really does concern me is it's about letting go. It's also this hierarchy of oppression. Like disabled people have a hard time and are oppressed, but other groups are also oppressed in different ways. And one of the problems that we're also seeing fought out in social media is this idea of, well, we suffer more than you, So, and Randall Kennedy, who's an African-American, he says, I refuse to be an accountant of atrocity, this kind of oppression Olympics. And it's endemic. Out there. The coalition building stuff is really important. So as I said to you, like one of the things I looked at last year was caste, the Indian caste system. And I was petrified because, I've studied the area, but you're treading on very delicate territory and looking at the ideas of degradation and humiliation and saying, what can we learn from that system that chimes with the disability experience? Where is it different, right? And they're the kind of conversations. And I agree with you with I think you should be able, in terms of your comment about that going to that conference, and I've seen those, is we should be able to live in both worlds, and I'm no great supporter of segregation, but one of the problems was when, and again, Phil will probably know about this, when normalization theory and social roles valorization theory came about, it was about separating disabled people from each other. But not just that, Wolfensberger said disabled people should be separated from other devalued people, right? So that's really divisive. So we need We need to have both. You know, I recently did a project with disabled prisoners in Scotland, right? And many of those, they were men, many of those men, they acquired their disabilities while they were in prison. They were older as well, but, you know, nobody had sat down with them to talk about that transition experience, yeah? And that idea of meeting other disabled people and what does it mean to masculinity. So I think we need to do more on that. And the final response, just by the way, to Phil's thing is, one of the things that I'm working about is to look at this theory of ableism to see how we can intervene in things. So it's always had a social change aspect, right? Because the other thing is, as I said, there's no enemy and there's no victim. It's constantly fluid and changes. So we need to be able to identify the signs of ableist ideas. And you can see this in COVID, right? You can see this with the response to COVID globally about which lives are worth living, right? The idea of human worth, and some of the kind of like who makes the decisions about who should be prioritized.
Yeah, I think I think we're coming, sadly we're coming to the end of time, but I think a couple of things occur to me. One is you've pointed up and talked about an area which I think Simon and I over many years have kind of talked about, is what can we learn from other groups? What can we learn from other movements? Your points about the caste system, for example, I've never thought of that. But when you come to humiliation and disability and caste, there must be things we can take from the experience of those who've been through that caste thing that we can learn from. The other thing that you've done for me, I've written a book, and not bad for a special school boy, really. And it's called Why Are You Pretending to Be Normal? And it's really, it's not in the league of your academic stuff, but what it's basically doing is saying, why do you continue to pretend to be what you're not? You know, this is particularly aimed at those who've become disabled.
Yeah.
And are hanging on to this old idea of who they
be. You know, there's Phil, two things, again, within the limits of time. There's a great 1972 Japanese film with some cerebral palsy activists, and I can send you the information. It's called ICP, and you know, one of the guys is on the floor in a suit. He says, "We'll never be normal. You're kidding yourself. It's a form of delusion, you know, to think that you will never be normal." So I think we need to kind of look at that, this idea of independence and autonomy. The other thing that I am starting to do work in, which is probably going to be quite controversial, is this idea of hierarchy in society. What does equality mean? We don't all have the same level of abilities. And in fact, it's often the people who are not able to fit in with the system, right, who constantly get left out. So how do we deal with differences in talent, in capabilities, at the same time to ensure that people are treated, you know, with dignity, you know, and that's another whole discussion. I mean, certainly one thing that's happened with COVID is the rise of the cognitive class, for example. So those people who think they're normal out there, just as a good kind of finishing thing, is there's a quote that says, "Today's normals will become tomorrow's abnormals." So we're seeing changes around. This push towards higher cognition means that there's going to be a whole bunch of folk that are going to miss out and are going to find themselves with us lot. And because we're such nice people, we'll welcome them in, won't we?
Of course we will.
And that's happened with COVID. That's happened with COVID, with people with underlying health conditions suddenly hooking up with disabled people online. And, you know, it's a bit of a rude shock.
Fiona, I have to ask you this is my last point. So I pretend I am one of the young whippersnappers who's throwing the words out. I'm challenging the orthodoxy. I'm saying we're doing it differently now. Isn't that, and then as you said, that then becomes what is the message? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? Aren't they meant to challenge the previous generation and start moving it forward? Are we trying to cling on to something? Isn't it time we changed?
I think it is, but to be honest, I think we are living in a really an era of censorship, of people not knowing how to dialogue and listen to each other. It's either like you're for us or against us. So actually, and there's a lack of self-awareness about where people are influenced by ideas that, you know, where they come from. So I think we're living in a very different world. I mean, social media, in terms of its flow of information and in terms of the dialogue, is quite different from, you know, the previous days. And as I say, I keep reading, keep thinking, keep talking, but we also need to learn the art of dialogue. How do we talk with people who have a different perspective from ourselves, and, you know, if we disagree with them? So my problem is, and I am an optimist, Simon, seriously, but I do worry that there's lots of bandwagoning. So suddenly, as I say, all these people are using ableism, and it's kind of like it's a new tool now, you know, and it's really offensive to be talking about the ables. Those ables, you know, what are we doing? You know, we're not the kind of Black Panthers or the Crip Panthers, you know. And I think the other thing is, you know, any politics just focuses on difference rather than also looking at similarity is very dangerous. It's very divisive.
Well,
Phil, do you have anything?
I look, I could sit here for the next week. I am just enthralled. I seriously, I think we have to get you back, and we definitely have to focus on other things. I'm going to.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back. I could talk to you about Chinese values and disability, for example. That's really interesting.
I just think that it'll be really interesting to see our postbag. I'm waiting to see what people think of, you know, what you've been saying, because I've found it enthralling. I've been in this industry and as a disabled person since I was a 3-year-old, and the journey you've described, I get completely. But the world we live in now is different, and we do have to find ways of managing that. So thank you so much, Fiona.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks for asking me.
Can I check, is my vacuum cleaner coming through, or is you can just hear me?
What?
I can't hear your vacuum.
Right.
No.
Someone's vacuuming.
That's hilarious.
I can't stop. It's here. Fiona, I just wanted to add too. I have loved every minute. The fact that we've not looked at our script. We had a whole load of scripted questions for you.
Oh, did you?
Yes. No, but they're the best ones.
You could do a part 2.
No, but we've sort of done it. Phil and I used to run a business. Every 6 months we'd go away, we'd make a plan for the next 6 months. We'd never look at it again, because that's what you do. And that's what's happened with you. And also, I am a little bit younger than you, but I feel I'm a bit of an old timer sometimes. And
you were just saying that you were young before.
I never said this. I was saying if I were a young whippersnapper. I'm not. My point being, I've been around for a while doing this stuff, not as long as many. There's plenty of people before me. The point being, you've made my heart sing. You've made me nearly cry. You've made me feel empowered. You've made me realize things that I didn't know that I realized. There's a whole bundle of stuff that you've done for someone who thinks they know quite a bit. And that I've thoroughly enjoyed.
Well, there's always things to learn. The thing that concerns me is the lack of historical memory. You know, I'm still haunted by the going into institutions. I mean, I remember holding dead and dying children because they weren't vaccinated. This is with the flu, because people said, well, they're going to die anyway. You know, it's so yeah, I mean, I'm happy to come back on and, you know, and have a chat with you, you know, and you've got my background thing. So I've also worked in the area of government policy with some of the big changes in Australia, and I can talk to you about non-Western stuff too, if you're interested, you know. So
I think one of the most important things you've said, along with all the others, is that we need to relearn and reconnect with dialogues with each other.
We do, and we need to look back.
You know,
we also need to, and it's not, you know, I believe, I mean, I left school when I was quite young, right? So I'm very much self-taught, right? And we need to. We are ignorant and arrogant if we don't look back at the past. Lots of people were thinking about these issues, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Fiona. It's been fantastic having you on the show, and an absolute joy. Yeah, I'm really pleased. I'm sure we'll be speaking again.
That's great. I've loved it. I've loved talking. You know, we're a community. I've loved talking to you about also where this stuff chimes with your own experiences as well, including experiences at conferences, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.